Up until the 1920s, when it was destroyed, there was an ancient church in Konya, Turkey, under the name of Saint Amphilochius. It was converted into a mosque when the Turks conquered the region in the 1300s. The Christians continued the veneration of the saint there. There was an ancient tomb that the Christians regarded as the tomb of Amphilochius, an early bishop who died around the year 400 AD. Curiously though, the Muslims regarded the tomb not as that of a Christian saint, but as the tomb of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. How they imagined Plato came to be buried there is unclear. It is certainly ahistorical, but it was part of wider traditions among the local Muslims, who, at least from the 1300s, seemed intent on imposing an ancient Greek layer upon Christian monuments. When Orientalist travellers such as Frederick Hasluck arrived in the early 1900s, they found a situation where Muslims and Christians shared the place of worship in a remarkably ecumenical manner, the Christians venerating their saint and the Muslims venerating the same man as Plato. Hasluck supposed that the importation of Plato was perhaps some sign of rapprochement of Muslims and Christians. Perhaps, he surmised, it was a peaceful gesture on the part of the Muslims. Rather than install one of their own saints in the church when it was converted into a mosque, they chose Plato as a neutral figure. It meant the tomb could be left intact. But this wasn't the only appearance of Plato in the region. Instead, as Hasluck and other explorers and travellers reported, the name of Plato had been attached to the wider landscape. For a start, the local monastery of Saint Chariton, an early Christian monk who had been born in Konya, was known unaccountably as the Monastery of Plato. Hasluck discovered that it too had ecumenical elements. There was a story that the son of the Muslim sage, Rumi, Konya of course was the home of Rumi, and this is the home of the so-called Whirling dervishes, the followers of Rumi. The son of Rumi, Sultan Valad, had fallen from a cliff above the monastery and was saved by a mysterious old man. Accordingly, the monks at St. Chariton installed a Muslim prayer niche in the monastery, marking the Qibla, the direction to Mecca, and every year, once a year, the local Muslim religious authorities would supply the Christian monks with a gift of precious oil in gratitude for the saving of Sultan Valad's life. So in this Christian monastery in Konya, there was a Muslim prayer niche. The Muslims can't recognize it as belonging to a Christian saint, so they call it the Monastery of Plato. Hasluck supposed that all of this came about as a result of political compromises between the Christian and Muslim communities in medieval Konya. It established traditions that continued through to the early 20th century. Further though, not far from Konya, is an ancient pool, a natural spring. It has been shaped and decorated by the Hittites in ancient times. It was known as Plato's Fountain, and it was said that Plato made the sculptures that are there. Even further, it was said that Plato had shaped the subterranean waterways of the Konya Plain. In fact, remarkably, in its fullest development, the people of the wider Konya region attested that Plato had controlled a great flood that had once afflicted the region and had created the pools, springs and underground streams upon which both urban and agricultural life depended. It emerges indeed that Plato was known in the region as the great guide to the underworld. Once, they say, the Anatolian plain was submerged below an ocean. Plato conquered the waters and drove them underground, lifting the landscape from the deluge. The caves and caverns and underground waterways of the region were especially associated with the great philosopher. This extends far beyond the political and religious compromises that Hasluck proposed. What we have here is a developed tradition. It has been developed against all historical probabilities, anachronistically, and it does much more than add a neutral figure between the Christian and Muslim communities. It is true that Konya has had a tradition of religious tolerance in the city, and the spirituality of Rumi, which is to say of the Mevlevi Sufis, takes a quite ecumenical form. But this doesn't account for the strange and insistent legends regarding Plato there. Plato, of all people. What is behind these legends? How has Plato's name become attached to these places in and around Konya? The answers must surely have to do with the other peculiar and unusual thing to do with Konya, the Whirling Dance. As Hasluck observes, the stories about Plato seem to go back to the time when the Mevlevi Sufi order was founded and the Whirling Dance, or the Samar, was established. Thus it is Rumi's son, Sultan Valad, who is connected to the monastery of St. Chariton. The early Mevlevi order is connected to these legends in some way, so the task of explaining how Plato turned up in Konya concerns understanding the origins of the Mevlevis and inevitably the Samar, because the Samar is a mystery too. The Whirling Dance, an elaborate ritual with orchestral music and a carefully choreographed liturgy, is an oddity in the Islamic spiritual universe and is famous for that reason. Actually, the Mevlevis resist calling it a dance because it is only barely acceptable to strict Muslim orthodoxy as it is. It is plainly ecstatic in nature. It is a remarkable and very unexpected expression of Islamic mystical fervour, unique to Konya. So the place where we find this extraordinary dance, or ritual, is the place where Plato was buried, after he saved the land from a flood, renovated the landscape, and established a monastery, among other things. We might suspect, for a start, that the dance, the Samar, has pre-Islamic origins. It is not by any means the first whirling dance in history, only one of the most spectacular, and an unlikely one in an Islamic context. As it happens, there is a long and illustrious history of whirling or circular dances going back into far antiquity, the subject of James Miller's definitive study, The Measures of Wisdom. Both as an ecstatic method and as a liturgical motif, people have been spinning around on the spot and dancing in circles in many cultures since ancient times. No doubt the Mevlevi whirling, or turning as they call it, did not appear out of nowhere and ought to be considered in that longer history of circular dances. According to the canonical narrative, the Mevlevi dance was a spontaneous expression of the love of Rumi for his master, the mysterious Shams of Tabriz, a wandering weaver. Rumi had been an ordinary jurist until the day Shams arrived in Konya. Rumi was spiritually transformed by his presence. Walking through the bazaar one day, he became mesmerized by the beat of the blacksmith's hammer on the anvil and rose into ecstasy. He started whirling around to the beat on the spot, an expression of divine love. This is the form that Rumi's spiritual illumination took. This was then formalized by his son, Sultan Valid, into the ritual known today, along with an organized Sufi order. That is the official story. That is the hagiographical story. But as Miller and others observe, the form of the Mevlevi dance is strongly cosmological, and it is widely admitted that it is done in imitation of celestial movements. The circular turning of the dancers is in imitation of the planets and other heavenly bodies. The ceremony has a cosmological symbolism, and the implicit cosmology is conspicuously Platonic. We are led to Plato's cosmological works, the Timaeus and the Critias. There Plato sets out the classical account, describing the creation and the structures of the world soul, and the various celestial movements. He describes what he calls the circles of the same and the circles of the different, along with the place of man in the cosmos. This account is accompanied very famously by the story of the flood and the fate of the continent of Atlantis. Miller notes that the analogy between celestial movements, as per this cosmology, and dance was well established in the Greek world, and indeed persisted into Byzantine Christianity at both the folk and liturgical levels. The basic idea is described by Miller thus, quote, "A human nous, or intellect, could imitate the flow of thoughts in the world soul by considering the various steps a dancer requires to whirl his body around in a complete turn and then in another and yet in another." Unquote. This is exactly a description of the Mevlevi turning, and in fact it underlines exactly why the Mevlevis call it a turning rather than a whirling or dancing. The dance, so called, consists of a continuous series of turns. In the Platonic cosmology, the self-turning heavenly bodies have the most perfect movement around an inner axis, and Plato analogizes this to the highest operations of the soul. It seems very likely, therefore, that the Mevlevi dance has a background in this ancient tradition, which is to say, dance understood in terms of the Platonic cosmology. This same cosmology permeated thought in the Greek-speaking world and persisted in Greek Christianity. When the Turks conquered Anatolia, they inherited a world in which Plato was a profound figure. All the same, Plato was a profound figure all the way to Bactria in Central Asia, and Rumi originally came from there. Hasluck's account of the Plato legends of the Konya Plain suggests they arrived with the Turks, but it would be more natural to think they were already established when the area was Greek. Where would the Turks get them from? There are many possible scenarios. One is that the reputation of Plato travelled with the Turks, and when they arrived in Rome, they understood it to be the land of the great philosopher, and his tomb is what they expected to find. Or perhaps it is significant that, in the story, a mystic arrived in town, Shams of Tabriz, and brought with him a revolution that resulted in the institution of the dance in his celebration. Perhaps this suggests the influx, the arrival of new knowledge to Konya at this time. In any case, there is good reason to suppose that the dance has pre-Islamic origins, either with the Turks, the Greeks, or through some other channel, and is most likely modelled on the basic ideas of the ancient Platonic cosmology. Modern accounts of the dance, where the dancers are said to circle the sheikh in the centre like the planets circling the sun, are anachronistic. The dance was developed long before the heliocentric model of the universe. The symbolism of the ceremony is complex and, of course, Islamic and cultic to the Mevlevi order, but it is easily understood as an Islamic adaptation of the cosmology of Plato. This inadvertently might then explain the characterization of Plato as the man who mastered the ancient flood and shaped the subterranean rivers. The Whirling Dance is under the inspiration of the Timaeus dialogue, but its companion volume is the Critias, Plato's account of the flood and of the detailed topography of Atlantis. Where do we find the idea of Plato as the master of the flood and of geography? The answer is the Critias, or the Atlanticus as it's called. The depiction of Plato as the master of the flood, such a strange thing to find in locations around Konya, has its roots surely in Plato's Timaeus Critias dialogues. The nature of the legends suggests they are remote from any direct engagement with the texts. Rather, it is something we have to account for by way of tradition and non-textual transmission. Anyway, we find a dance that reminds us of the cosmology of the Timaeus, and legends of the flood that remind us of the Critias. It's the cosmological Plato whose tomb was supposedly in the church of St. Amphilochius. How exactly this eventuated is difficult to say. It is covered over with the pious foundation myths of the Mevlevi order. Very likely it involved moving the dance from outside to inside Muslim orthodoxy. That is to say, there was a process of legitimation. To claim to have the tomb of Plato, the divine philosopher, his relics no less, is no small authority. Hasluck notes what he calls an ambiguous cult that he suspects was shared by Christians and Muslims in Konya. It seems that a body of knowledge, cosmological or cosmo-spiritual, Platonic in any case, was transplanted into Konya, literally into the landscape, and the development of the Mevlevi order and the dance are part of or a consequence of that transplant. It is very unlikely that these things are all unrelated. Or is it that these things were there in Konya already, and the arrival of Turkish rule, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum or the Sultanate of Konya, brought them into the open, into an explicit form? Perhaps there was a body of pagan tradition there as a very ancient city that survived through the Christian era and then was expanded and flourished under the Muslims. The Sultanate was barely 100 years old when Rumi's family settled there and occupied lands previously the domain of Greek Orthodoxy and the Byzantine Empire. Rumi was a Persian and the Seljuks were Turks, but the ancient heritage of the region was thoroughly Greek. The Seljuk conquerors and the Persian immigrants escaping the Mongols in Central Asia were newcomers to a land previously shaped by ancient Greek traditions. Perhaps these Plato legends weren't transplanted, but germinated from existing seeds. One thing is clear, we can detect some necessity in it. St. Amphilochius is a very unlikely Plato. He was actually renowned for his lack of academic prowess and his lack of engagement with books and learning. He was known for simplicity, piety and zeal, not learning. His traditions emphasized this. He was not in any sense a philosopher. If his tomb has had the name of Plato imposed upon it, it was perforce, and not because of anything about Amphilochius, on the contrary. And yet for centuries, Christians and Muslims made devotions at the same tomb, the Christians to Amphilochius and the Muslims to Plato, and the two communities seemed agreed upon it. Such a mismatch, Amphilochius and Plato, suggests that the identification had to be done, entirely against the evidence. For some reason, it was imperative. This again might suggest some political or religious settlement, but for the wider tradition. There are signs of it, for example, in the Mathnawi, the great poem by Rumi, revered by Mevlevis as a type of parallel scripture to or commentary on the Quran. It is largely a compendium of stories in the Persian style. It includes, for example, stories about the weaver and the blacksmith. And remember that motif is there in the story of Rumi meeting Shams, the weaver, and being taken into a trance by the blacksmith's hammer. It is typical symbolism of the Mevlevis. This is a type of signature from Plato's cosmology. In the Timaeus and the Critias, Plato specifically invokes the deities Athena and Hephaestus, the deities who rule the crafts, Athena the weaver and Hephaestus, that is Vulcan, the blacksmith. Indeed, the Platonic cosmology is crafted, that is the right word, from the mythologies of those deities. So when we meet stories about the weaver and the blacksmith in this context, we have reason to once again be reminded of those cosmological dialogues by Plato. This is evidence of much more than a political deal. The symbolism of the Timaeus Critias extends into Mevlevi devotional texts. There is the coherent, intelligent use of Platonic symbolism and the mythological background of the Platonic cosmology. The role of Shams of Tabriz remains a mystery though. Was he the transmitter or just the impetus, the catalyst? Why is he necessary to the story? His relationship to Rumi is exactly that of Platonic love. Rumi's ecstatic whirling was an expression of his love for Shams. Shams is directly connected to the origins of the dance. Perhaps what we see is several different streams of tradition merging into each other, into the Mevlevi synthesis, under Islamic rule, in the language of Islamic piety, but also very physically under the auspices of Plato, and apparently, if Hasluck is right, with some degree of Christian complicity. How did all of this follow from the arrival of Shams el-Tabrizi in Konya on the afternoon of November 15, 1244? For the Mevlevis, that was the pivotal event. Rumi met Shams. They marked the day. Mevlevi spirituality radiates from that meeting. This speaks of a transfer of esoteric knowledge. Shams, they say, brought a different type of knowledge than the ordinary knowledge Rumi had learnt as a jurist. This is very likely to offer a key to Plato in Konya. Regardless, what we find in Konya, most unexpectedly, is the imprint of a Platonic tradition upon the sites and landscapes of the region. The identification of the tomb with Plato suggests an accompanying cultus. The tomb is the thing of greatest interest. A tomb, relics, are important. Tombs are the centres of traditions. We can assume it was regarded like the tomb of a Muslim saint or a Sufi. The teachings of this tradition, the cosmology of Plato, anchored in very specific texts, then finds expression in the form of a circular dance. This then had to be accommodated to the Islamic atmosphere and was legitimized through its association with Rumi, and was at length formalized into the Mevlevi Sufi order. One suspects, though, that the real key to this, and the person responsible for how it has been constructed for us, is Sultan Valid.